Hi everyone. What do we mean by the word creativity, and what do we mean by creative thinking? We're going to start with a little anecdote here, a little example of creativity that kind of arises in 1917 when the Society of Independent Artists in New York calls for works and submissions by artists, members of the society, and they will accept any piece of work as long as it meets the requirements, which is basically, will the artist pay the inscription fee? And they received a very famous work of art from one Marcel Duchamp, a urinal tilted onto its back and signed by the artist under a pseudonym, Armut, with the date 1917. Now, is this art? Is this creativity? It's certainly filled our museums and our city centres over the last century with a lot of conceptual art, where basically the museums are buying the concept from the artist and not really buying the work. Anyone can go down to their local B&Q or their Leroy Merlin and buy a urinal, put it on its side and sign it. Well, it's creative in its moment or not. Now, lots of the society board members rejected this as a work of art. They rejected it as a work of creativity. But for the artist and friend of the artist, Beatrice Wood, who's a fine artist in her own right, definitely a very interesting artist. It was art because Duchamp had created a new meaning for what was an everyday object. He'd given this object new meaning. He'd taken it out of its normal context, put it in a new place, and this was, in fact, creativity. Creativity then is combining, it's fusing to create something new, original, and useful to someone, somewhere. This is the full definition from Keith Sawyer from his book Explaining Creativity. Creativity is the generation of a product that is judged to be novel and also appropriate or valuable by a suitably knowledgeable social group. Now, the original urinal met with lots of resistance, but there are now, I think, 17 official versions of Duchamp's urinal, and people queue up to visit it and to see it, which I'm sure he would find hugely entertaining. This idea that something needs to be accepted, it needs to be found useful, it needs to be valuable for a certain group of people, can be a little bit complicated, because a lot of creativity in its time is not appreciated, and it's not until hundreds of years later that it's accepted. And it's shown in the example that Chuck Klosterman, the cultural commentator, gives us from the magazine Colophon, which asked its readers in the 1920s, I think it was, to propose artists, writers that they thought would be still famous in the turn of the century, in the year 2000. And a lot of the writers on that list were indeed, and are indeed, still valued. Eugene O'Neill, for example, Willa Cather. These are writers that we still appreciate today. But a lot of the writers that didn't appear on that list, James Joyce, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, are hugely famous, and in fact much more famous than lots of the writers on this list who have since then kind of disappeared. So this how we judge, how we value creativity, and how we value the creative thought in our research as well. We do need to keep a very open mind that what sounds like a mad, crazed idea could be, in fact, the future of our academic area of research, really. Here we've got a pile of bricks, which for a lot of people is not really creativity, but if you're a museum like the Tate Gallery, this is a work of art. Tracey Emin's Unmade Bed, which was hugely popular in its moment. All of these are examples of what we might call expansive learning. By creating new things, we expand our knowledge, we expand the concept of something, and when you get to your doctorate studies, to your doctoral research, what you're learning doesn't exist when you wake up in the morning, and that's why it becomes quite complicated sometimes to make that jump from the traditional academic world of learning somebody else's knowledge or learning the knowledge of our teachers to generating new knowledge. And that really is the work of research, and that really is the work of a doctoral thesis, is to expand our idea of this area. In the bibliography for this module, you've got a link to Yrgo Engestroms. I hope he doesn't see this video. Probably destroyed the pronunciation of his name. And his concept of learning as expanding our concept of something, the whole concept of expansive learning, which is also a manner of solving problems. Can we classify creativity? Now, according to Beghetto and Kaufman, we can. They give us 4 definitions of creativity. First would be mini-C, or intrapersonal, or creativity. In fact, the picture up here is probably a little bit little c, because it's shared with me, but the doodling on a piece of paper, the ideas that I have could be micro c or mini c, personal creativity that I don't really share with the rest of the world. This could also include my imagination, imagining things, the capacity to see things which aren't there yet. All of this is key to our personal creativity and our academic creativity in this sense. Maybe then I start to bake my own bread rather than going down to the shop to buy the bread. This is definitely a confinement hobby of mine, and huge numbers of people all across Europe started to make their own sourdough bread. Here's my own very fine example, if I say so myself. This is expanding my knowledge, definitely, of what bread is and the process that goes into it. So to become more creative, we have to become more doers, more participants, practitioners, if you like, of what we have studied. And that's all about research, that's all about investigation, is much more doing and less consuming somebody else's idea of bread. We'll come back to bread a little bit later, because one of the activities that we're going to use to learn a creative process has a lot to do with bread, as you will find out soon. If I then take my daughter's work of art and I put it in a frame and I hang it on the wall, like some of the fine works of art behind me, I'd be getting into small c creativity. It's not really yet professional c creativity, where my daughters could be teaching other children how to paint. This would be a lot of teaching, a lot of the academic world, all of our lecturing and teaching activity, where we're teaching other people like ourselves to do what we know how to do. This would be what Beghetto and Kaufman call pro-C creativity. And then they make this huge leap from pro C. I think there are probably lots more C's in between, up to big C creativity. And this is a kind of creativity that changes, if you like, the way we view art, the way we view science, if we're getting into Darwin level creativity or Einstein level creativity. And this has been a little bit problematic, because this is, in the early years of creativity studies, a lot of the investigation was focused on the concept of genius and the concept of great creative people, generally men, generally white, and I think it's kind of can be a little bit negative in idea. This concept that there are creative people, I believe, and we're going to see this when we look at creativity as a process, that you are creative if you do creative work, and you can practice this, you can learn it. There are techniques, there are tricks that we can use, as we're going to see in this module, and then as we're going to see in module 4 when we look more at researchers' design and design thinking in research, that there are many ways that we can be creative without necessarily being a Velázquez, Frida Kahlo, an Einstein, Marie Curie. We have many other ways of being creative and doing creative work. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this module. Here you've got a nice kind of a little graphic here showing the link from mini C to little c to pro C to big C, greatness, creativity. But we could probably think of many more C's to include here, many more levels of creativity. Which C do you think these are? This early cave painting, this is one of the early ideas of decorating our homes without necessarily going to IKEA to have somebody else's idea of what our home should look like. What would you consider this? Is this big C? Is this small c? Is this micro C? Or is it pro C creativity? We can't really know. The graffiti on this train, how would we classify this? The first thunderstones, the hand axes from the African valleys, is this big C creativity? Well, obviously in its effect, yes, but how was it valued by the colleagues of the early creators? Were they possibly getting angry with the guy or girl who's sitting on the floor creating, banging two stones together? Again, this is creativity. We're combining two things, two stones which already exist in the world, to create something new and useful. So useful, in fact, that we didn't really use anything else for the next 2 million years. The first Star Wars film, what distinguishes the creativity of the first Star Wars film from the creativity of the third prequela or sequela? Well, here the concept of originality is important. The first Star Wars film is original. By the time we get to the eighth film in the saga, we are a little tired of this creativity. If we look at areas that would stimulate creativity, this children's park, we could say, well, this is a place where they can practice their creativity. But in this park, which is actually built by children, as long as we're not taking the concept of child safety too seriously, is much more creative, because they participate in the construction and in the idea of what it is to create a park. Desire lines that we find through parks and in our cities, are these examples of creativity? Well, for me, they are. They're also an example of the kind of rebellion that we need to be creative. All creativity rebels, questions what went before. And in this sense, to be creative is to question, is to change, is to find a new path to get from A to B. It's not perfect. It's not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, but it is creativity. Jamie Oliver's paella with chorizo, is this creative? Is it acceptable? This is something we have to decide upon when we value creativity. But if we're valuing it from creativity, well, yes. We also have to think of what the Chinese must think when they see our version of arroz tres delicias, their rice. These bananas wrapped in bacon and covered in a beautiful hollandaise sauce. Is this creativity? Well, in originality, yes. Whether it still finds value, we find it valuable and acceptable as food, now that's a different question. Not many people would doubt about David's Michelangelo's David, as creativity, but other great masterpieces from the Renaissance, like this salt and pepper pot, we probably would doubt it if we were given this as a wedding gift. It might end up kind of tucked under the bed, and still it's one of the great works of art of the Renaissance. Also, our capacity to find good problems. Now, in this module and in the next module, we're going to really be looking at how we can find better problems to solve. As researchers, as investigators, you really need to know how to look for good problems to solve. In this study by Csikszentmihalyi and Jacob Getzels in the 1980s, I believe it was, they pitted artists from the Chicago School of Art against the problem. They put them in a room and asked them to paint this still life that was there. They discovered that there were two types of artists. There were problem solvers who immediately got down to work painting or drawing their works of art, and there was another group of artists who took a lot longer before they got started, and they'd leave, they'd go back, they'd come again, they'd look at it, and then finally they'd get down to their work of art. When the two groups were compared, when the work of the slow thinkers, if you like, and the fast artists were compared and evaluated by the teachers of the Chicago School of Art, Getzels and Csikszentmihalyi found out that the work of the second group, the slower thinkers, the messier artists, were considered to be much more creative, and their works of art were, when they revisited these groups again, they'd actually had a more successful artistic career. So a lot of the ways that we've learnt to deal with problems, to deal with work throughout our academic career, which has been very much focused on thinking fast, on solving problems that our teachers find for us, doesn't actually help us to become much more creative when we need that creativity. So in this module, hopefully we're going to find and reflect a little bit on some techniques that can help us to slow down the thinking, to open, if you like, a parenthesis between the problem that we are approaching and our ideas on that problem, and to become much better at finding good problems to solve than at solving problems fast. Okay, we'll be back in a little with another video.